Good morning, everyone, and welcome to a special live edition of VLGA Connect on climate change emergency action planning. My name is Chris Eddy. I'm pleased to be your host and moderator for today's session. We've had more than 150 registrations for today, which demonstrates the very high level of interest in this topic and in our speakers. So we're looking forward to sharing some wide-ranging information with you over the course of the next hour or so. Can I firstly please acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of the various locations from which our participants join us today, and we collectively pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So without further ado, I'd firstly like to introduce from the VLGA, the Chief Executive Officer, Kathryn Arndt, who joins us this morning. And Kathryn, welcome to a special VLGA Connect.
Morning, Chris. It's a pleasure to be hosting this event, and to see the interest that we have is quite a good example of why it is important that we're talking about it today.
So perhaps set the scene for us just briefly. How has this particular topic come to the fore and this particular session become one that you are keen to do?
This is something that we've been talking to EY about now for probably about 7 or 8 months, and was really an opportunity to bring in EY to give their reflections on some of their international, national and local experience. As you know, we've got participants today in the audience from across Australia, so it's a topic that's relevant to all of us. There are, of course, some excellent local council examples of climate action plans and initiatives, which we intend to follow up at a later stage and host a panel on that. But today, the Victorian Local Governance Association is pleased to introduce EY's Climate Change and Sustainability Services team, who will be essentially delivering our discussion. The EY team are experienced in helping councils to develop climate action plans, which includes working with councils both in Victoria and interstate. So they do bring with them quite a diverse and extensive range of experiences. They also have experience working with state and national government to advise on emissions and risk-related climate change issues. So the team have brought together a discussion today in particular about climate emergency action planning in post-COVID-19 times, which is again very relevant. We have limited time today, but hopefully we'll have some time available at the end for Q&A, and as you've indicated to the audience, please log those questions in the chat function. And Chris, now I'll hand back over to you to introduce the panel.
Thanks very much, Kathryn. And I note that we've got about half the number of those registered that are in the session so far, and people will join us no doubt over the next 5 or 10 minutes or so. So firstly, I'd like to introduce Brendan Tapley, who has 15 years experience in climate change and energy, with significant experience working with local government, not just in Australia, but in the UK. Brendan and I were chatting the other day about his time in London, I think it was. Developing zero net emissions and climate adaptation strategies has been a key part of Brendan's work, and he leads EY's climate change government advisory work nationally. And just before I throw to Brendan, I'd like to also introduce Robert Kyne. Robert has over 8 years experience across government, consulting and startup environments, with extensive experience in developing outcomes-based frameworks and systems, policy development and economic analysis, including economic development strategies with a sustainability focus. So Brendan and Rob are going to do a bit of a tag team for the next 20 minutes or so on this topic, this information that I know our viewers are really keen to get to. A little later on when we have Q&A, there will be a couple of other EY panelists that will join us, and we'll introduce them at that time. So without further ado, settle in and hear all about climate change emergency action planning from the EY team. And Brendan Tapley, over to you. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Chris, and thanks also, Kathryn, for the introduction. Welcome, everyone. It's great to be here. So we've got a slide deck here which covers several topics, beginning with Australia's challenge and opportunity post-COVID. So we reflect upon some of EY's recent research around COVID and implications for us in Australia. We then move into the bulk of the discussion, which is focused on climate action planning insights. with somewhat of a focus around the social and economic implications and opportunities as part of the climate action planning process. And then we'll move to question and answer and next step discussion. We want to leave at least 15 to 20 minutes at the end for that discussion. For the Q&A, we'll be joined by a couple of additional colleagues, which I think Chris and Kathryn alluded to, so Josh Martin and potentially Devinka Pierce Senior. We do have some gender balance on our panel, who will jump in if and when needed later on. So firstly, just to introduce our team, we have a climate change and sustainability services business, which is about 250 people strong across the Asia Pacific region. We have different focal areas, and climate change is one of them. So our climate change team has a focus on climate risk, scenario analysis, climate change strategy, including emissions and mitigation plans, climate risk and adaptation planning, and then moving over to the social and economic impact assessment aspects of climate change. There are some additional services we offer, including climate finance and green bond advisory and assurance, energy efficiency advisory, and then broader non-financial sustainability reporting and assurance work. So touching on how Australia could be well positioned to recover post-COVID, the infection rates and death rates have been much lower in Australia than in other countries. So it's multiple times, lower than our peer countries, which presents an opportunity for Australia to recover and loosen economic and social restrictions relatively soon. This is timely. There is an opportunity for green stimulus, and we're also beginning to see some more movement at a national level, such as with the King Review and the Technology Investment Roadmap that were announced in the last month, basically looking to promote an investment in green technologies. EY has been doing some recent research around the impacts of COVID, which we call the Future Consumer Index, and we're seeing four key trends coming out of COVID. One is impacts on globalization and trade, with the potential, for example, for more localizing of supply chains. So some of the companies that we work with are considering that. Technology and innovation changes, and today's webinar is an example of that. Societal impacts, including consideration to existing marginal groups in our communities, some of which will need extra care, and also considering the health impacts of events like COVID. And then behavioural shifts where we, where I guess, for example, where we see different consumer spending patterns in terms of where they put their time and money, and that's reflected in some of our research where we do identify there is some spending less, but there's also a number of people surveyed who are spending about the same or even spending more in some areas. However, climate and energy challenges will persist. So the recent bushfires becoming a little bit distant in the light of COVID, but obviously it was far-reaching and significant in terms of the impacts we had in Australia. Global warming is, a significant issue. So whilst there's been approximately 1 degree global warming since 1950 in Australia, globally, in Australia that's a lot higher. It's more like 1.5 degrees, and it's even higher than that in the southeast of Australia, which is closer to 2 degrees. So the impacts are significant. Some of the forecast impacts, need to be taken seriously. So we look at grain farmers in parts of Australia who are facing declines potentially of up to 50% of their productivity if significant adaptation measures are not put in place. And that's based on Commonwealth Bank of Australia's research in their annual report. So significant infrastructure investment is required to improve resilience. That then leads us into the energy transition. So net zero emissions by 2050 are becoming a norm. So we have more than 121 countries, which represents 25% of global emissions, who are now aiming for this type of a target, and that's reflected across the states and territories now in Australia in terms of the targets that are in place. We're also seeing movement internationally. So Europe's proposed Green Deal, and in particular its carbon border adjustment, which will basically incentivize low emission commodities coming into Europe, creates both risks and opportunities for Australia. So opportunities on I guess the green export side. So our investment in hydrogen and electrification and renewable energy are all opportunities. and on the risk that's around the traditional fossil fuel powered mining, metals, manufacturing, and commodity production. Another example internationally will be South Korea, where they've announced net zero emissions goals by 2050 with recent announcements to boost its carbon pricing mechanism, setting itself on course for a clean and resilient transition post-COVID. There's other drivers which we'll touch on in a little while, such as regulators and technology change, which are both opening up change and opportunity. So we also wanted to touch briefly on how is Australia tracking in terms of its emissions. So we are faced with a gap at the moment. We have a 26 to 28% reduction target below 2005 levels by 2030. At the moment, the coded carryover credits are really a kind of a linchpin in the current policy to try and put us on track, and that's prone to change. So we do need to be acting quickly and faster than we are, and there is an opportunity for action across the jurisdictions, so at a federal but also at a state and local government level. So at the local government level, it's been quite exciting to be working with local governments, finding the opportunity for leadership and working with communities to really drive change from the bottom up. Globally, more than 1,700 jurisdictions in over 30 countries have declared a climate emergency. Around 100 of those jurisdictions, which represents about a third of the population, have also declared a climate emergency, so that's in Australia. And then 1/3 of those declarations are in Victoria. It's about 32 councils. So whilst councils do have their limits in terms of their powers, they can act as an enabler. And so that includes leading by example, advocating for broader action from state and federal government, forming partnerships, such as, for example, with power purchase agreements, and strategic partnerships to drive change. Some of the main drivers that we find for the climate action planning by local government includes growing community interest, and this is really becoming a key driver, and we're seeing this in the climate emergency declarations, where there's community groups who are kind of working with council to drive that change. Regulatory guidance is increasing, so whilst that tends to have had a little bit more of a focus in the private sector, that is beginning to transfer to the public sector. So, for example, the Australian Accounting Standards Board has released its Practice Statement 2, which provides clear guidance around auditors needing to consider climate risks when auditing financial statements, so that then transferred to those within local governments preparing the financial statements. There's clearly a background of state government initiatives that provide context and some momentum for change. Directors' duties has been a topic of discussion in the last few years. The Centre for Policy Development has produced a publication basically performing a view around that public sector officials basically are expected to plan for climate risks as part of their duty of care. And we then have a host of legislation, which I'm sure many of you will be familiar with, such as, in particular, the Local Government Act and the Climate Change Act, but also other legislative frameworks. So we wanted to move into climate action planning now. This page provides a snapshot of, I guess, a 7-stage approach which we've applied in working with local government to support the development of climate emergency action plans. And so I guess I'd highlight here that the approach and the timing for the approach will differ. It depends on the particular needs and the scope of the work and the amount of consultation that's undertaken. However, this provides a useful signposting just to talk through the general process. So beginning with stage 1, the project initiation and planning, a pretty normal start to a project. We move into stage 2, which we like to set out a consultation and engagement plan really early. So that just helps to identify who are the key stakeholder groups internally as well as externally, relevant community groups to engage with, identifying modes of communication. Then typically there'd be a blend of ways to engage with the community. It could be public forums, it could be pop-up events, it could be newsletters and other forms of engagement. And also the engagement plan would agree on the timing for that consultation. Stage 3 begins to be the I guess, a focus for the analytical work. So the research and analysis, beginning with a gap analysis of where is a council placed at the moment? So what has it done and what hasn't it done, compared to a reputable framework. So for example, the C40's climate action planning framework would be one. There's guidance around climate emergency planning, and I'm just on echo now, so I think that's better. Yeah, thank you. And there's also work through ICLEI, through the Global Mayoral Initiative, giving guidance around energy and climate change action planning. So they can all provide useful signposts to just identify where are some of the gaps for climate risk and adaptation and mitigation planning. So then I'll touch on the climate risk adaptation and emissions analysis a little bit further in a couple of slides. Around this point of stage 3, there's also optional further analysis, which councils have asked us to do, and they've found useful, which includes social impact analysis and economic impact analysis. A third one is around power purchase agreement options, which can obviously feed into the energy strategy for a council. So that would enable us to effectively begin to draft early draft report sections, which then takes us into stage 4. We have some information prepared to then take to stakeholder consultation. We develop the materials with messaging and conduct the stakeholder workshops. So that would typically include potentially key community stakeholders and obviously EMT and councillors. That takes us into stage 5, preparation of the draft strategy and presenting the draft findings. Stage 6, a public engagement exercise. And then stage 7 would be the finalising of the action plan. We wanted to just briefly give us a snapshot of what could the timeframes look like. And again, these are, the timeframes are adjustable. However, it gives you an idea of what rough timeframes could we be talking about. So I guess some of the key points here would be the stakeholder consultation and public engagement elements can take time, and so that needs to be adequately factored into the time frame. So some of the key considerations for a climate emergency action plan include advocating. So as I said earlier, there's limits, and I'm sure many of you are aware, there's limits in terms of the roles of councils as opposed to other jurisdictions, other hierarchies of government. So a starting point would be implementing. So what can the council implement itself, and what does it have responsibility for? So a good example would be council's own assets and operations as a starting point. So that would be reflected in the council's corporate or organisational emissions profile, potentially identifying opportunities for emissions abatement from its buildings and its perhaps its transport fleet and its general operations. And we move down to incentivising and enabling. So this is where the council can begin to play more of an active role with reaching out to the community and beginning to influence emissions abatement and increase resilience and climate risk management amongst the community through actions that might incentivise, perhaps linking into broader, say, state government incentives, beginning to form partnerships that could enable further action, and then down to the advocating. So yeah, for example, advocating for state and federal government reform. The community stakeholder engagement planning is super important, and it's really a fundamental part of the climate emergency action planning process, and that also touches on the public and community participation strategies that most councils have in place. So it very much builds on that existing framework. Some other key considerations include the target setting, and that being based on the latest science. So here are some examples of some useful standards and tools for emissions mitigation. So the Greenhouse Gas Protocol is it's a pretty standard protocol which has a community-focused standard, which we use when we're developing community emissions profiles. There's also a version of that can be used for a council's organisational footprint. Emissions profiles, there are some templates that exist that can be useful, such as the C40 Cirrus tool, which just can help to map out the emissions by sector. We also often use marginal abatement cost curves, which we've developed both at a state and local government level. So there's a few options there. It can be at a residential, commercial and industrial sectoral level, which can be scaled to any local government area for more than 20 technology types, including a range of energy efficiency and some renewable energy technologies. It's also possible to apply the MAC data to different sectors. So we've also developed MAC curves for all sectors, actually: transport, agriculture, manufacturing, et cetera, et cetera. And we found that can be a really useful messaging tool for councils. So, for example, to be able to communicate, we've had a council we've worked with where it's been in the hundreds of millions of dollars, the scale of investment required to achieve a certain energy and emission savings target in the community, and having that information of that potential cost and also the saving has been quite helpful for communicating and kind of connecting with the community around climate change. So some other examples here would be the decision support and action prioritization tools, which are necessary when you have a long list of climate-related actions. It could be emissions abatement, and it could also be adaptation-related. And we then need to prioritise them down to a short list, and considering a whole range of criteria, such as impact, feasibility, the power and role of the council, scalability. There's a whole host of co-benefits, which my colleague Rob will touch on shortly, and then measurement. Another tool would be our emissions pathway planning tool. So this is an automated tool where it can just be useful to indicate firstly a council's emissions pathways, and so we can set out different scenarios here to illustrate, for example, by how soon could a net zero emissions target be achieved. And the other use for this is it can also allocate the climate actions based on what does the council have control over, and what are more advocacy type actions where it's actually more, say, for a state government level, potentially Commonwealth government level to implement, and assigning the portions of that emissions budget. So moving into climate risk assessment adaptation, and in the time we have, really we're just giving you some snapshots here, and I highlight that we're happy to take questions later, and also offline we can get back to you with any further questions. So we have a five-step risk assessment process, which is tried and tested, and that will lead us into developing a climate change risk register. Some of the outputs of that type of the identified risk outputs and the risk register are kind of shown on this dashboard. It's an example of how we can create a dashboard visual, which is aimed at, I guess, simple communication or communicating our various findings in a snapshot. And I think I'm about due with my time, so I'll move on to Rob, who's going to talk us through a discussion around socioeconomic impacts. Thanks, Rob.
Right. Hi, everyone. My name is Rob Kyne. I'm a manager at EY in the Climate Change and Sustainability Services team. Specifically, I'm part of the outcomes management team, where we do a lot of work measuring impacts that are difficult to or not typically quantifiable. Before I begin, I'd just like to thank VLGA for giving me the opportunity to talk to you all. It's great to be here. So as Brendan just alluded to, I'm going to talk to you about measuring socioeconomic impacts of climate change action planning. I'm going to go into why it's important, the process we undertake to do it, and then how we can use the results. So why is it important to measure socioeconomic impacts, particularly under a sustainability and climate change lens? Why isn't avoiding global catastrophe brought about through climate change typically enough to spur action? The first reason, present bias is a real thing. It's hard for society as a collective to understand threats that are far in the future. What people do understand is immediate and tangible effects, whether that's positive or negative. The second thing is that traditionally climate change action has always been framed around the cost. What is climate change going to cost us? What is the cost going to be to mitigate against climate change? By measuring the socioeconomic impacts of climate change mitigation or co-benefits, it lets us completely reframe that discussion around the positives. It's no longer what is this going to cost, and instead it's what is it going to generate in terms of benefits for my community. The second reason is to understand the impacts that our interventions are causing. You want to have a good idea of what your actions are going to generate in terms of impact before you do them. This can be to help you prioritize your actions, make sure they align with your strategic goals, or more broadly, just allows you to understand what you're going to change in your locality. And it also lets you understand the possible negative impacts that might occur and how this is going to impact your local population. Well-intentioned but misguided action can actually hurt certain vulnerable populations. So it's really important that you understand what your action is going to impact and then to what extent. So taking the example of an energy efficiency program that provides a subsidy for solar panels, that still requires a significant upfront capital investment. Even with the subsidy, many disadvantaged people are going to find this out of reach because they don't have that initial capital investment. So I'm sure some of you, or a lot of you, have probably heard about the electricity death spiral, which was coined back in 2012 by a pair of economists in Australia. For those who haven't, it explains a situation where prices rise, causing more people to go off-grid, leaving fewer to pay larger fixed charges. Ultimately, those with the money to go off-grid will do so first, and those that don't, typically the lower socioeconomic, will be last, leaving higher charges for the ones that are left, which, you know, it's a well-intentioned policy, but it might have actually spurred on the disadvantage of an already disadvantaged group. So that's why it's important to understand and measure the impacts that your initiatives are going to have so you can compare those trade-offs. The third reason why we measure impacts is to develop a solid evidence base. Governments around the world are looking for the best way to stimulate their economies at the moment. One of the major reasons that more traditional projects get funding so often, for example, roads, is that they have very well-defined business cases with well-understood evidence bases as to an understanding of what the benefits that they drive are. That's job creation, driving productivity, that sort of thing. They have very well-defined metrics. If climate change activities and mitigation initiatives want to compete for funding against these projects, you really need to have the same quality of evidence backing them. You want to be able to show the benefits that the initiatives deliver, so that you can compete against, say a road project. This gives those with the purse strings the ability to act, and really lets them fund things with confidence and stand behind that project. The final reason we measure impact is as a communication tool. As a local government, you want to be able to demonstrate the value you're providing in your community. Measuring impact, whether that's social, environmental, or economic, gives you the ammunition you need to put it back to your community and say, this is what we've done. And through this, you can get buy-in for your actions to support more initiatives when people can see this evidence. And finally, just touching on, I guess, something that Brendan noted earlier, is that there's also a legislative driver now. The Local Government Act 2020 now has specific clause around it into taking account the environmental, social, and economic impacts of actions. So there's even further emphasis on that. That's basically a brief rundown of why we measure impacts, namely reframing, understanding, evidence, and communication. So probably the trickier question then is, how do we do it? Particularly when the link between how climate change initiatives result in positive impacts and benefits is not always direct. For starters, I don't tend to separate social and economic impacts into completely separate bundles. I like to combine them into one broader analysis in terms of what their impacts are on society. And I really think that that is key in terms of what you're doing and for creating that justification for the project. So to start off with, you want a detailed description of your initiative, what's happening, what's being produced, what activity is undertaken, who it affects, who does it benefit or negatively impact. And from the detailed description, we would generally generate a pathway logic, which is step one. I'll go through this in a bit more detail later, but essentially we visualize the links between each of those components that I just told you, and we generate causal pathways between action all the way through to outcome and value. Going back to what I said before, it makes the link between your action and your impacts really clear. This is a great tool for convincing decision makers and illustrating exactly what is going to happen from the initiative. It's a really useful narrative tool. Internally, it's the same. It provides a visual reference that really makes us think about how your actions are going to impact various stakeholders, both in an economic, social, and environmental perspective, and helps you think through any of those negative impacts that I spoke before. Step two is looking at the context of inclusivity. This is really important, especially from a local government level, when you want your climate change actions to really benefit the vulnerable. It's important on both the economic and the social side. You can get situations where your consumer and producer surplus is generated from any climate activity can disproportionately go to the best off. So using the example I mentioned earlier, you might have a net positive impact from a subsidy for solar generation. But that doesn't mean it's going to be distributed evenly across your population. So, and if it just benefits the most well off, then it might be against what your strategic objectives are. So it's a really important thing to actually look at how your policies are going to actually affect the target groups that you want to look at. Accessibility. So when we look at initiatives, we predominantly look, in terms of inclusivity, we predominantly look at affordability, because most climate change action requires upfront capital cost, which then realizes a significant saving. When capital costs are high, this naturally locks out a large proportion of the vulnerable, who are vulnerable because of their socioeconomic status. Accessibility and inclusion are two other significant outcomes that we look at in regard to climate change mitigation policies. Once the analysis is done, we can categorize the actions of climate mitigation policies into the most inclusive actions and the least inclusive actions. Again, helps with prioritization based on what your kind of strategic objectives are and your goals in relation to the inclusiveness. In the end, you have an analysis that demonstrates what generates the most value, but the analysis can also tell you what's the most risky in terms of inclusion for vulnerable groups. So next up, local context matters. You need to get input from local experts to really drill down into the local context. We run workshops to verify our assumptions, and we identify the ways in which initiatives will work and also verify our pathway logics. Essentially, we're using that stakeholder consultation and the local experts to verify everything we do. And we use it as an input to make sure the local context is covered and we haven't missed anything important. Finally, once we have all of our data, so step 4, we undertake the analysis. The completion of this stage really sets out a clear idea of what the overall benefits of the action plan are, but probably more importantly, also shows the relative benefit of each individual action so that you can prioritize easily and effectively. From a communication standpoint, it illustrates why you're choosing what you're choosing, whether that be because of stakeholder concerns or the relative costs and benefits. Ultimately, it loops back around to what I was initially talking about, which is developing a justification and illustrating the activities in terms of their benefits. So you have that evidence base behind everything you're doing. In addition to this, from a local government perspective, we really want to look at this in the frame of what local government can control and what the functions of local government are. This is an example of an impact pathway. And I'm always happy to talk this through with people who are interested in it, but it's basically the narrative tool that I was talking about. In this case, we've got a transport intervention, which is around increasing parking pricing and getting through to reducing car usage within a local government. So first up, we describe the activity. So what is changing at the local government level? Then you have the output. What changes? What's the actual physical change that happens as a result of that change in policy? Third is the outcome. And that is essentially the change in the behavior of a population and how that change actually manifests itself. And then the impact is how we measure the positive or negative effects that might happen as a result of that. And then we can quantify those impacts as a result. So yeah, happy to discuss that in more detail with people in the future. So the final thing I wanted to touch on briefly is quantifying and comparison. This is essentially an expansion of the evidence side. At the end of the analysis, you want to get to a point where you're prioritizing your initiatives and have a justification behind it. Some of the options include full cost benefit analysis of initiatives, when we want really detailed look at benefits available to us, including market impact assessments, value for money frameworks, cost effectiveness analysis or qualitative cost benefit analysis, multi-criteria analysis when we want to look at things in a really broad scope, different strategic goals and not just the relative cost and benefits. And those are the four broader frameworks that you can use. To finish us off on the back of talking about just cost benefit really briefly, I think Brendan is just going to take us through some of the climate related opportunities that might be looked at as part of this. So I'll just flick back to him now.
Thanks, Rob. I think we wanted to conclude the presentation just by reflecting on where are we heading, and this is based on some of our work at both state government level as well as with local government, where we've looked at it at a sector by sector level. What are some of the risks but also opportunities presented by climate change? So firstly, with residential and commercial buildings, I think the opportunity and the vision there is around efficient and resilient buildings, both at a council level, but also within the community, where the council is leading by example. From the energy perspective, there's a vision for clean energy exports, and we know that a number of councils have either been investigating or actually actively pursuing power purchase agreements, and are also looking at carbon offsets as an additional option. There is an energy hierarchy that we would follow, and that begins with the low-hanging fruit first. So energy efficiency, moving towards on-site renewables, and then eventually you can go to off-site renewables. For waste, there's obviously, waste is very topical at the moment. The circular economy is getting a lot of attention in Victoria. The state government's been doing quite a lot of work to develop its approach to the circular economy, and that's I think there's opportunities at a local government level to capitalise on that. For transport, this is another key emissions sector for local communities. And resilient and low emissions transport infrastructure is the way we're heading. Electric vehicles are predicted to be at price point parity with fuel combustion vehicles within the next 4 to 5 years, which clearly presents some opportunities around electrification, particularly where that can be powered by renewable energy. And manufacturing is, I think it's an exciting opportunity in Australia, particularly as we move towards a larger share of renewable energy, and interesting opportunities in terms of international trade. So like we spoke about earlier, the carbon border adjustment in Europe, which is effectively incentivizing low emission commodities to be imported into Europe, has knock-on effects indirectly back to Australia, as one example. With respect to tourism and also to degree education, an opportunity for clean, green and innovative tourism, and promoting Australia as that destination. Within agriculture, which is actually a major emission source across Australia, there are opportunities for reducing emissions in terms of better farm management, better livestock management, lower methane emitting feedstock, and various other abatement measures that we've looked at. And then land use again is another large opportunity for carbon sink, and so there are some existing incentives in terms of national schemes to encourage that, and we think there's opportunity for further reform to further promote that. So I think, Chris, we then wanted to move into discussion time.
Indeed. Thank you, Brendan. Thank you, Rob. There's a lot of information in there, as people are acknowledging, and we do have quite a few questions already. Please, if you have a question, paste it to the chat box or type it in the chat box. I'm going to bring Kathryn back now, the CEO of the VLGA, to help work through these questions. Kathryn, that was a pretty interesting session, and judging by the questions that are coming through, people do want to explore some of the detail.
Yeah, look, thank you, Chris, and thank you, Brendan and Rob, for that presentation. There was a lot of detail in that, and as Chris said, we'll make that available to everyone when we send out the recording. Now, there are quite a few questions, so perhaps I might hand over to Sue Phillips. You had a few questions. Did you want to ask those of the panel?
Well, I'll just go through and find my first one. I did these as the slides came up. The first tool looks like it's used in a multi-benefit approach to assess actions. Does this mean that carbon emissions and drawdown are given the same weighting as cost in the multi-benefit approach? So this is before the socio-economic talk was started. And there's a second question from Dominique that feeds onto that too, directly underneath. It says, given the IPCC has said that 1.5 target can't be achieved without drawdown. Actually, maybe answer mine first. So are carbon emissions and drawdown given the same weighting as cost in the first tool that you discussed?
I probably don't have a simple answer for you, Sue, because there's various weightings assigned to the tool. We've got a large list of abatement actions and different priorities, and I'd have to check the model to give you a definitive answer. Yep. Yeah, but because the focus for the work has started at obviously at a council level, so you know, across stationary emissions, buildings, waste, transport, mainly, that's been where the focus is in terms of the weighting. We have a whole range of co-benefits that are in that tool. So in addition to the emissions, you know, factors, we've also got co-benefits around health and well-being and social, kind of economic, environmental aspects that are weighted. So maybe we'd be happy to talk you through that decision support framework tool in more detail offline, and we could, you know, probably have a more detailed discussion about how it works and the weightings. The other thing I'd say is that it's all completely adjustable. So for every time we use it, we would tend to, you know, reset the settings and make sure that's tailored towards the local council that we're working with, and the time in which we're using it, so using the latest data.
And I suppose that speaks a little bit to my last question, which is, I've got 3 questions, but I'll jump to the last one, was your 4 points in your socioeconomic analysis section. You were talking about 4 points of analysis, and 3 of them were cost-based again. There was cost-benefit analysis, cost-effectiveness analysis. I missed the next one when I was typing this up. And the final point is multivariate analysis. And so again, I was concerned about why the impetus for analysis, again, wasn't based on carbon reduction and drawdown as the primary drivers for action. While it's useful to have multivariate analysis and other co-benefits that are identified, this is ultimately a climate emergency strategy. So, and this is our one opportunity to have key drivers that address the climate emergency. So if we're putting those other analytical elements up higher, we're not going to necessarily get the outcome that we need. Mm-hmm. The other question that I had was, and there's something that Dominique wanted to ask building on that, but I'll just jump to my last question, was given that some of us develop our climate emergency strategies separately from our climate emergency action plans, how would this be useful, your presentation on your work would be useful for just developing an action plan only and not the overarching strategy? So it may not have that level of detailed analysis in the overarching strategy, but this could be a useful framework to use for just developing an action plan with council.
I think from just a socioeconomic impact perspective, any sort of evidence base that you can put with your climate change mitigation, your action plans is still going to be helpful for any communication, advocacy, etc. I think it's never kind of mutually exclusive, and there are different levels of detail that you can actually do this kind of analysis at. Mm-hmm. I always take the view that more evidence backing up anything that you're doing is always better, whether that's from a communications point of view, an advocacy point of view, you know, trying to convince people, that sort of thing. So I think you can still do it, and there's definitely appropriate ways you can do it based on the level of detail that you want. And I guess that's what I'd respond to that with.
Thanks.
Thanks, Rob, and thank you, Sue, for those questions. Could I just ask that if you do ask a question that you turn your camera on, because I'm just reminding people that we also record this as a web episode for publication later. So it'd be great if we could see you as you're asking your question. Kathryn, I wonder whether maybe we go on to Dominique, given that there was a linked question.
Yes, now Dominique, Brendan has asked if he could perhaps take that offline and get back to Dominique in regard to that question. If that would be possible, Dominique, I hope you don't mind that. There are a few other questions to get through as well. I'm just going back to Annie from Noosa, I believe. You had a question that you'd like to ask.
Yeah, thanks for that. Just curious as to the development of your MAC curve for community action and how you have estimated the emissions reduction from various community programs such as, you know, solar bulk buys or education programs or advocacy or, you know, whatever your actions are in there. Given that, you know, we've used MAC curves internally for working out our capital projects, and that's been pretty straightforward. But I just wouldn't mind if you wouldn't mind talking to the community MAC curve. And do you actually do that right down to the local government level, or is that sort of at a higher level? Thanks.
Sure, I can answer that. So there's two scales of the MAC curve that we can apply. One would be at the local council level. So, and that would clearly be based on collecting relevant data, including the energy and emissions data for, for the local council based on its assets and operations. And we do have our own data set of technology-based marginal abatement costs and potential savings, which is based on broader analysis of opportunities across Victoria. So that can be scaled down to the local government level, considering locally available information and initiatives that you might have already been had undertaken. So that's the first level, the council level, and then the second level would be at the community level, where we've got different ways we can do it. I think on the slide we mentioned that there's the commercial, industrial and residential sector MAC data that we have. So those three sectors have different types of technology-based opportunities for each of them. And that can be applied at the community scale, again, based on any information, recent information you might have, and we can add to that that list of technology options. So if there's a particular scheme that's up and running, that can potentially be incorporated based on the data being provided to us. And then I think on the slide we also spoke about going beyond those sectors to other ones. So we could potentially expand to agriculture or beyond manufacturing, land use. There's also some abatement options that we have there as well, basically covering all sectors. And so we do have several data sets that we can rely on, and that can be tailored to sectors across the local council. And yeah, we definitely would seek to draw on the latest schemes, programs and actions that you've been undertaking so that we can incorporate that into the marginal abatement cost curve.
Thanks, Annie, for the question. Great to have you with us from Noosa. In fact, we've got participants right across the country on the session today, which is fabulous. Kathryn, who's up next?
I believe, Joanna, you had a question, although it might be more of a comment. Would you like to talk to that?
Hi there, sorry about that. It was just with regard to, and it possibly was on the slide, but I missed it, if the speed of emissions reduction is considered as is that weighted as sort of the main factor? And maybe it was covered off a bit with, I think it was Sue's question before, just with regard to, it is an emergency, and obviously we need to look after the most vulnerable as a very high priority. But if we are delivering all this zero emissions by 2050, then that's too late. Obviously, the earlier we can drop it harder, the better. Is yes, I'm getting at? Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah. So we do indeed look to identify how soon the net zero emissions can be achieved. That's part of the analysis. So that's what our pathway planning tool can enable us to do, is to map out how soon that can be achieved. And often there'd be, we'd actually look at say a 2030 timeframe and a 2050, or that could be a 2025, 2030 and 2050 timeframe, and providing a view as to what's possible within those timeframes. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Alan, you had a question earlier on in the session around a particular council's example of a zero net operating emissions strategy. Would you like to talk a little bit about your question?
Thanks, Kathryn. Yeah, I'm a member of the Bayside Climate Crisis Action Group, and I also help in a few other local government areas. And I was quite impressed with the idea of the council's operating emissions committing to zero net emissions from now, rather than planning ahead 5 years, because as other people have commented, we have an emergency here and immediate action's pretty strong, a strong issue. And I guess my impression was that because effectively any decision that produces emissions within the council will now have a price on it as of this year, I think maybe it might drive a lot of middle management and other people who haven't seen themselves as having significant roles in climate action to focus their minds a bit. So I was just interested in EY's thinking on that logic and the idea of early zero net emission targets of various kinds by councils, but also maybe by individuals and organisations in local areas.
Yep. Thanks, Alan. So yeah, agreed. There's absolutely an opportunity for earlier action and net zero emissions targets to be aimed for. I had the message texted through to us as well around the buying the offsets and where that sits in the scheme of things. So the energy hierarchy would kind of follow logic that we'd go for the more cost-effective and impactful options first, and that would, to date, that has typically been starting with energy efficiency measures, where the lower investment paybacks are more bang for the buck in terms of energy and emission savings, and then that moves up the scale to on-site generation, which a lot of councils are actively involved in. And in fact, some councils have got to the point where there's not much more, say roof space for solar that they can feasibly install. And so they're now looking to further down the energy hierarchy, which should be around the off-site options for renewables. And then beyond that, it's then looking at offsets. So there is that process to go through in terms of, picking off the opportunities. And I think the offsets, there is a role for them, provided that you've also gone through that process of identifying and pursuing the other opportunities as well that could be, could be cost effective.
Yeah, if I can just comment, in their draft strategy, the Bayside Council have demonstrated that they are reducing their emissions through a range of strategies. So this offset thing is not by any means the only option.
Sure.
But I guess from my point of view, I get concerned when people have 5-year plans to achieve things, because my experience both in the public sector and other areas is that if you haven't got an immediate signal to the people making decisions that is quite tangible to them, they always put it off and they go through lots of process, and we maybe don't get anywhere. Anyway, that's just my cynical position, I guess.
I can maybe just quickly add to that. Well, I know in speaking to a council that we've been working with in the Climate Action Planning Project, that I know that one of the next challenges for them is around actually getting suitable information into the council plan. So they've actually been going through the climate action planning process, and that's fairly well progressed. But the next step is to build sufficient direction in the council plan to give weight to further implementation and further action moving forward. So I know that that's a key requirement the councils will need to be considering and incorporating moving forward to make sure they've got the leverage to fall back on to provide the resourcing.
I was just going to quickly say to add on to that, one of the pressure points, I guess, that Alan is experiencing there is one of the reasons that you do kind of want that evidence base as well. So you do have that immediate positive, tangible effect that you can communicate, whether that's a positive co-benefit or not. So you can communicate the benefit of that within that 0 to 5 year kind of plan.
Kathryn, we might go for one more if you have one more, given that our time is almost up.
Yes, I think there is one from Dominique that perhaps she would like to ask. I know one of her other questions has been taken offline, but Dominique, would you like to ask your latest question? Thank you.
Oh, perhaps I'll try. Thanks. Kathryn, I'll try and ask the earlier question a bit more simply. Does the modelling include drawdown technologies? The pathway to net zero include drawdown technologies? Because we have to have them if we're actually going to be able to achieve a 1.5 target. So
yeah, it can do is the answer.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
So to my earlier question, I presume then you've got the data available.
Yeah. Yeah, so we do have data available across a range of different abatement options, and that, like I guess, as I mentioned earlier, around the sectoral coverage, that includes both, you know, stationary energy sources such as you see through, say, commercial residential buildings and manufacturing, but also over to agriculture and land use and land use change in forestry, where you'd actually find those carbon sinks, which provide significant opportunity for reducing emissions, offsetting emissions. So that both are definitely possible, and we have recently been analysing both. We have developed map curves for both across all sectors, and that's definitely applicable to local councils. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Dominique. Brendan, are you happy to go a little bit longer? Because I noticed we do have a couple more questions coming in. Some people are leaving us because obviously they have other commitments, but we still have 90 odd folk on our session. So if you're happy to go a few more minutes, can we take a few more questions?
Sure.
Kathryn?
There is one from Vicky Parrott. Have we heard from Vicky?
There were two questions really that I have put in the chat. One was about the use of global reporting initiatives, those reporting standards, whether or not they are effective in a local government sense. And the other question I had was to say how useful that climate action hierarchy is, but how do we actually, as a stakeholder group, how do we actually encourage councils to focus beyond their own emissions that implement and really engage with their communities on the incentive and enable?
Yeah, okay, thank you. Well, perhaps with the latter part of the question about engaging with communities, so that's an iterative process which needs to be developed. I think a previous slide we showed or suggested that right up front we would usually develop a consultation and engagement plan around stage 2. And that's an opportunity to really tailor the consultation engagement plan to the specific community groups. So we would list out who are the specific community groups that we want to engage with, when do we want to engage with them, how do we want to engage with them, which, as I think I mentioned, that typically could be a blend of like forum-style workshops, particularly with the internal stakeholders within the council. And then when we move into the public engagement, there's a range of measures, and sometimes a blend can be really useful. So it could be leveraging the council's existing website and engagement techniques such as through newsletters, and additional specific events where we can invite the public to come and participate. Pop-up events have also been used, so tying into, say, community events, outdoor street events, where you can have a pop-up stall, provide information and that kind of thing. So yeah, I think that there's definitely a range of options, and it just needs to be tailored to the community and to community groups. The timing is important to make sure sufficient time is given for the consultation, to give people time to provide information and provide input, and then that enables us to reflect that into our work in a way which has buy-in and support from the community.
Thank you, Brendan. And I think we've got one more question here, which we may as well go to, if you don't mind, and that's from Gail Price. Gail, is Gail still with us?
If not, perhaps I can ask the question on Gail's behalf. I think Gail might have dropped out. Gail is asking if Brendan, if EY is doing any work on the evidence of interconnection between social and economic that's been thought of in separate compartments previously, having regard to what we've all been experiencing with the pandemic in recent times.
Absolutely. Yeah. So we are. So some specific examples would be where we've conducted. Well, so I think Rob might also want to kind of help to answer this, but I'll give it a first go. So the social impact assessments that we've done have been in conjunction with the economic studies for councils. So it would be a social impact kind of causality model we would use to identify the impacts to society from climate change, to local communities. And then there would be the economics comes in several forms. So there's the marginal abatement costing element, which, as I said earlier, is a really useful way to provide a snapshot of the scale of investment required and the savings potential for a community, which, because it's more of a granular metric you can provide, that can provide some weight in terms of anchoring the message for the community. there's other tools we've used, such as around cost benefit assessment, which opens it up and enable us to assign costs and benefits sometimes to non-financial metrics. So the co-benefits that Rob kind of spoke about, for example, can be brought into the cost benefit study. We then have other technical work we do, such as around input-output modelling, where we actually develop a model, apply a model based on the economy, inflows and outflows, employment generation opportunities, gross value add, these types of metrics that can be brought in. So we actually have a range of ways we can identify the economic opportunities for a local council. And the thing I'd add to that would be some of our recent work with state government has really been focused on answering questions around what are the risks and opportunities across our economy from climate change, and how do we rate those risks? Where are the priority ones that we need to address, and where are the opportunities? And we've applied an economic lens over that. So we've been able to identify, say, considering where more of the employment is, and the emissions impact potential, what does that mean? And how can we transit to a low carbon economy? So yeah, the short answer is yes, and it might be worth a separate conversation if you wanted to pick that up further, Gail.
Yeah, as Brendan said, and if Gail's dropped off, I might send her an email of some such to follow this up. But yeah, the answer is yes. We do look at the economic impacts of social impacts, essentially. So taking your example of COVID, there's obviously been some significant mental health impacts as a result of COVID, and we can actually quantify that kind of stressor and look at the dollar value of that, so that we can put that into a cost benefit analysis, and really measure that impact.
Thank you, Rob, for that. And I think we've got time for one more question from Lenka Thompson. Lenka Thompson, would you like to ask your question?
Hi. Yeah, thank you. Just quickly, I'm sorry I came in late. I'm just wondering about your experience with rural councils, and whether the lack of resource for rural councils has sort of inhibited them implementing like climate emergency action plans.
Yes. So what I can probably speak to with the rural councils is, I think some of the challenges and opportunities that we've noticed. So clearly the agriculture sector has a higher profile than other councils when you're in rural areas. There are a range of challenges in terms of reducing emissions in rural areas. Clearly there's also a range of risks and impacts from a physical climate risk perspective. So I think we gave the statistic earlier around the Commonwealth Bank of Australia's annual report last year, which identifies significant potential impacts to farmers across Australia unless they implement significant adaptation measures. So both from an adaptation perspective and emissions mitigation perspective, there's challenges, but there's also opportunities. So that leads into more a need to make sure there is some type of a risk or adaptation plan in place. For the council, but ideally also, considering the community. On the emissions side, so we've looked at a range of different emissions abatement options for the agriculture sector, and some of them are still work in progress. So, for example, developing low emission, low methane producing feedstock, say algae, for example, is still R&D is still being put into that to make it more effective to roll out. And so there are some cost implications for some of the more potentially impactful options, and we expect those costs to come down over time. For other options, they're more straightforward. So farm management plans, such as New Zealand is encouraging through its emissions trading scheme, seem to be working well. And then you have the different opportunities for government to so educate, incentivize, promote those types of opportunities for in the agriculture sector. So again, that's a topic we could probably speak to in more detail, with you directly if you wanted to talk about the rural councils and some of the challenges and opportunities there. Yeah.
Thank you for the question, Lenka. Thanks, Brendan. We're going to have to wrap it up, unfortunately. We have gone over time, but really thank you for your patience and for sticking with it for the extra time. Brendan, Rob, terrific stuff. A lot of interest in the information. And as we mentioned, the slides will be sent out to all the registrants. Included in that will, as I understand it, be some contact information for you both if people would like to continue the conversation and reach out to you by phone or email. So we'll make sure that's in there. As you can see on the screen, this episode will be edited and uploaded as a special episode of VLGA Connect. We produce 3 or 4 episodes a week currently on a whole range of issues, special topics, regular governance and news updates. So please have a look at the playlist on the VLGA YouTube channel and subscribe to be kept up to date with this type of information as it gets produced. Kathryn, thank you for a great job there in moderating the question part of the session, and you'd be pretty pleased with how this has ended up.
Yes, I think it was an excellent conversation. Thank you to Brendan, Rob and EY for your participation today, and also Chris, on behalf of the VLGA, thank you as always for your excellent moderation skills of these VLGA Connect programs. As I said at the beginning, we do intend to host a panel in the future where we will have some councillors and even officers talking about their very own specific climate action plans. I think on slide 6 of Brendan's presentation, there was an outline of the legislative environment in which councils are having to not only grapple with community health and wellbeing plans that are a 4 years in length, but also financial plans that are 10 years in length, but then working within a local government framework where the Local Government Act is recently passed in 2020, but the Planning and Environment Act is still a 1987 version, and we also have now new legislation that has come in since that time, such as the Environmental Protection Act and also legislation in regards to climate responsibilities. So it is a very complicated environment for local government, and I think it would be well worth us following that up with a discussion about how some councils are dealing with that and doing it very well. So thank you to everyone who participated today.
Terrific. Look forward to that. And if I could just give a couple of quick plugs before you all leave us. Coming in the next 24 hours or so will be a special roundtable edition of VLGA Connect with 5 local government CEOs talking about what is the new normal that looks to be emerging from COVID-19. That promises to be a fascinating conversation. And our next live panel opportunity is about 10 days away, so stay tuned for more information. We're going to do a session on deliberative engagement, and we've got an expert on sortition. If you weren't familiar with the word, as I wasn't, it's the art of building representative panels when you need to go out and do this deliberative or participatory engagement, which is a new requirement embedded in the Local Government Act. So that session is going to be a live panel session, and look out for the details. We'd love to have you as part of that in the very near future. Again, Brendan, Rob, thank you very much for being part of our session today, and we look forward to working with you in the future, and all the best with your climate action emergency plan working.